You know what? I have a crazy windstorm going on here. Can you hear it?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Nicholas DeMoncho, Head of Architecture here at MIT. I extend my thanks and welcome to all of you joining us tonight. Given that MIT still exists in the world in a physical place, which we are slowly and steadily coming back to, I want to begin by saying that MIT acknowledges Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land, and that the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. Now, the risk of these words, of course, is that they just remain words. The best possibility, however, is that they shape our reality just as surely as the tools and mechanisms under discussion tonight. Before I turn things over to Brandon Clifford, who will moderate tonight's conversation, I'd like to say a few words of introduction. The project that inspires tonight's conversation is part of our efforts here at MIT to sustain our community at a time of pandemic isolation. In this case, through the entirely logical step of having students build their own CNC machine at home and collaborate virtually in their use of them in additions and prosthetics to their current lifestyles. It is a way to have a certain measure of the pleasures of creative life, even amidst the challenges and separations of this year. Tonight symbolizes for me personally one of the other pleasures of this studio, introducing old friends and new friends to each other. Virginia Sanfratello and Catie Newell are both dear and old friends of various continents and vintages, and Zain Karsan and Brandon Clifford, new friends and current collaborators at MIT, along with all the students in the studio, of course, as well. It is such a delight for me personally to see them engage with each other and all the possibilities of creative community that collaboration represents. But more of that to come. Official introductions to Zain, Catie, and Virginia will all come from Brandon, but it falls to me to introduce Brandon himself, who's been a particularly valuable and instrumental collaborator to me as the incoming director of our MArch program. Brandon is officially also the Director of Matter Design and an Associate Professor here at MIT Architecture. His work has been supported by many grants and honors, including a Rome Prize, a TED Fellowship, the SOM Prize, and the Architectural League Prize for Young Architects and Designers. His practice, connecting craft and knowledge from traditional eras to digital practice today, often across millennia, makes him indeed a time traveler, and one whose focus on reuse, play, and the role of design in marking place and community a particularly valuable visitor to our current moment. And now is indeed the moment to pass it over to Brandon. Thank you, and thank you all again.
Thank you, Nicholas. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. Schools of architecture are struggling with a problem during the pandemic of how do we offer access to fabrication equipment in safe and equitable ways. And in a very MIT way, we're experimenting, as Nicholas mentioned, with flipping that question on its head of how can we distribute fabrication resources to our students. So this semester, our very own Zain Karsan has been running an exciting research studio tackling this very hypothesis. And in Zain's own words, his research develops low-cost, open-ended, and distributable rapid prototyping tools to support remote making in a post-pandemic era. The students in Zain have been working feverishly on creating, installing, and fabricating interventions in their own personal spaces. And we'll get to that soon, but today's conversation is primarily focused on two very exciting and provocative contributors to the studio, Virginia Sanfratello and Catie Newell. I have to say, I'm thrilled to make these impossibly brief introductions because I've been following with wonderment the careers of both Catie and Virginia, and very much look forward to what is likely to be an enjoyable and expansive view of the future of fabrication. Catie Newell is the founding principal of Alibi Studio, and as associate professor, directs the Master of Science in Digital and Material Technologies at the University of Michigan. Catie's been awarded the prestigious SOM Prize, the Architectural League Prize for Young Architects and Designers, a Lucas Fellowship, a Kresge Artist Fellowship, and a Rome Prize from the American Academy in Rome, along with countless others. So for the sake of today's conversation, I will frame Catie's work within the context of an economic crisis, as her work directly and indirectly addresses the realities of the city of Detroit following the 2007 economic crisis. Not only, but for the sake of today's conversation. Catie's work sheds light on intangible and often neglected experiences through the productive irony of creating tangible material interventions. As if this weren't sufficient for tonight, we're also joined by Virginia Sanfratello, co-founder of Real Sanfratello, established in 2002 following the attacks on the World Trade Center. This practice was established with the goal of imagining alternative outcomes for creative practices in a post 9/11 world. So you might be catching on to a theme here surrounding creative practices operating in response to socioeconomic crises. Virginia is chair of the Department of Design at San Jose State University, and her works are in permanent collections at MoMA, SF MoMA, and the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum. Virginia's work folds together indigenous and traditional craft and material practice, contemporary design technologies, and storytelling as strategies to unravel the complexities of society. For me, this is one of those things that distinguishes Virginia's work, that despite the beauty of the objects she produces, it's never about the objects themselves, because Virginia creates captivating objects of curiosity as lures, vehicles, and proxies to tell stories about pressing issues. So whether it be tactility, intimacy, experience, character, mood, or crisis, the works of both Virginia and Catie advance the discipline of architecture by shattering its own disciplinary boundaries. And herein lies the topic of today's conversation. How do we produce physical artifacts that in turn raise questions about the human condition? So Catie's going to present first, and then Virginia. But in the meantime, please help me welcome to MIT, Catie Newell and Virginia Sanfratello.
Thank you so much, Brandon and Nicholas. Thank you for tonight, but also the invitation to join the MIT community for this semester. It's been wonderful to be working with Zain and the students and to be in a consistent conversation with Virginia. Tonight, I'm going to share some work that I hope aligns with the ethos of the studio we've been working on. I'm going to mainly center around a project that Alibi Studio is currently doing. It's a work in progress and something that has been slowed not just by the pandemic, but many other stories. And I'll provide some interludes into this project by sharing some of our other work, as well as I think Alibi Studio is at a time of thinking through how we're going to continue to scale up, how we build, how we care for the materials in the city and the spaces that we're around. So I'm going to share my screen here. So the project itself and the title for the lecture or this short talk is called Hideout. And Hideout is a building that we're working on to be the studio for Alibi Studio. And is a building that sits back deep off of a street called Mount Elliott that's in Detroit, Michigan. And you can see on the one side is our historic cemetery. And actually the building, as seen from the view above, is actually very hard to see. It's sat back here, it's behind the trees, and has been out of sight for quite some time, given that there were homes in front of it that were only recently demolished, recently meaning in the last 4 or 5 years, that exposed this space, which became something that we took great interest in. We have, unfortunately, in the city lost many trees to things like Dutch elm disease, but also to things in terms of just the clearing of land or clearing of spaces. So for me, actually one of the strengths of this building that stood out was its relationship to the high canopy that it had above, and also some of the trees on the sites that were around it. There's also a key thing that I'll mention right here in terms of the no demo, which will become important in a moment in terms of thinking through this building. Just giving you a few cents around when we acquired this building, you can see some of the trees having had a long life as well. The building's about 102 years old itself now, really kind of leaning in and building into the building. And then you get a vantage point here back towards the cemetery as well. Moving around then to the inside, maybe perhaps what I should give as the biggest reveal of this building. And I think in some definitions, probably a building might be a stretch too far. It's a roofless structure. So actually it's walls. Alibi Studio has acquired some walls. And this was near to the condition of when it took our fancy and we started to actually imagine what could become of this space. This is an interior shot. You can see that over time, just with there being no roof, lost to a fire decades and decades ago, just the kind of increase of soil and the plants that grew, but also you can see smaller built-in spaces. This was actually a sawdust building in Detroit, and where the kindling and the scraps from the lumber yard that was just the other block over would come and become the kindling and the sawdust, and it was what was used to put on top of the ice of our roads before salt was used. So the first kind of efforts were, of course, to clear out the space, to get a sense of it, but also to make it safe again. And this is a theme I'll start talking about quite a lot in some of our work, is this idea of tending to a space. This gives you a little bit of a sense. It's roughly about 27 by 80. So it's rather quite a large space. And as you can imagine, there's some important structural issues to consider, not just from the general age and wear and tear of the building, but also because without the roof, it's missing some of the lateral support that would otherwise be on the very long, the long walls. And then, of course, naturally, it's open to the sky, right? So a kind of large, expansive light, and in a way, because it's walls, otherwise, this sort of giant opening that's rather maybe a surprise or hidden still from view from the outside. Now, Alibi Studio, for most of our work and earlier things, we aren't actually, we don't often do, I'd say, normal drawings unless we're discussing our need to go through for kind of permit or the conversation with contractors. Often our drawings have a lot more to do with trying to capture immaterial effects or talking to machines, but this actually is probably one of the most important drawings that we have done in the last several years. And I mention that because technically this building is a technicality within the city of Detroit. If a building does not have a roof, it's automatically on an emergency demo list. And so I had to work very carefully with the city and very quickly in terms of putting forth a permit to do renovation to this building to get it off of the emergency demo list. But the reason I say this is so important is actually prior to this effort, it was not possible to get a building off the emergency demo list without entirely renovating it. And Alibi Studio was coming at the project with an interest to stabilize the walls and to work carefully with the building to understand what might be the best way to then add to the built structure, or basically add a different or change life to it. And so through some years and some many meetings and some wonderful conversations, we were able to set up a system within the city that we're quite proud of, where someone now can do a renovation of something so extreme like this that would be otherwise demolished through phases. And so this has opened up the ability to allow others to take on projects that I think otherwise would either be completely demolished, never completed, or maybe held back on what their innovation could be. So I just mentioned this as a strange and what seems like a very simple drawing set for how we fix the walls, but actually very important for how we started to relate to the city. And so then the effort was actually to fulfill that set. A few things that I'll mention just quickly is we had to add, for example, as I mentioned before, the lateral support. So we added shortened walls. We were very particular about where those would end up going. This was a way to also acknowledge the relationship to the trees, to basically allow them to win, and to do a few things where we would, for instance, cut some of the windows down so they would be doors. And I'll show this more as we go through the set. But this brings us a little bit to thinking about one theme I want to talk about that's important to Alibi Studio and fits as well with the times, has to do with how we really work through considering tending to existing spaces. So a project that we recently completed, basically in terms of just opening it and celebrating it right before the world drastically had to shut down, was a project called Secret Sky, also in an existing building. In this case, we were working on a barn in a more rural area of Michigan, but started in the same sort of way. As a studio, we were asked to work if we could reconfigure a barn structure, which was to be of a series of barns that was no longer being used for a barn, and then instead was being gifted over to the work of either designers or artists to figure out ways to rework barns and allow what is otherwise a set of buildings that were falling apart in rural Michigan to be re-enlivened for the sake of the region, and also for the sake of not losing kind of a historical building structure that's otherwise becoming more and more replaced by either newer forms of building, or the fact that the landscape's being used in such a way that the barns don't have to be used for livestock or equipment anymore. So we spent a lot of time tending to a barn with what I'll advance to an effort of wanting to actually create something that, since it no longer had to be used for its original use, could be basically a gift to the sky. In fact, it was the original kind of concept and idea was to think through in this amazing open space where sunsets and sunrises were so incredibly long and the weather of Michigan changed so drastically that a work or a building, and this of course also relates to our roofless structure now too, could find itself actually having light as the occupant. And in a way it could be reworked such that there would be new volumetric forms, probably forms not possible in its original use, but forms that spoke not to just the iconic setup of what that barn was before, but also offering something new and a different way to experience the landscape or the building as an architectural object itself. And so in this case, the barn, it was a barn kind of sitting in a solitary setup, set off the road, short face, running kind of parallel to the road. And you can see there also that there are trees that end up kind of hiding the view of the barn and this initial arrival by driveway to the land, both for the equipment you can see going to tend the crops, but also anyone arriving to the barn. And so we worked very carefully to develop something that could be a slice that'll let the sky in. And of a key interest, though, was for this not to be simply just a cut into the walls, but to literally be a spatial modification. So one can think about how the siding actually turns and moves through the building. And it's siding that was collected from a barn nearby as well that unfortunately blew down from a windstorm. But the cut was made, and you can see it now. This is actually, in essence, standing in the slice. You can see a cut being from the front and from the back, basically an extrusion of a form all the way through, with also maintaining a little bit of structural integrity, of course, at the top. And as I mentioned, it really became, at the beginning, a kind of tending and living with this space, which I think is something that we at Alibi Studio really work towards in terms of even understanding what we should do. So here you see the space before our intervention moving through, and some structural feats that ended up being needed to be undertaken and to allow this consideration to happen. And so this is now viewing back from the opposite side, caring greatly for the material and the patterns that were originally there, blending in what was once before and after. And then the careful details of figuring out how a slice that was not originally there both meets with the barn, but also ends up being key to the, just kind of key to reading the details and fitting in to the logics that were present. This just gives you a sense of some of the slices and the important points as we move through. And then this goes back to the driveway in terms of the area when one arrives to the site, and really kind of getting that cut from the sky and the continuation and understanding of the architectural space, more so as it relates to the environment that's around it. One of the key things we have been able to do in this time recently was to add a consideration of studying its relationship at night, of course, as well. And we initially did this with bright lights when it opened, but over the pandemic, and this is now lights inside the barn, lighting outward and making these stripes along the landscape, giving you this sort of lantern. This is something we've been currently studying and just about to install the solar panels that allow this to be a nightly occurrence, so that the barn can turn on each night for about 2 hours and have this experience of the nighttime and understanding what that gift of light is back from the barn to the land as well. This kind of wraps that through. This is actually a moonshot, so that the lights turn off and night, of course, gets to cut through the barn as similar as the daytime does as well. And so the sky and the transition from day and night is very important. And so now back now to our hideout space that we've been working on. I think it's important for us to think through how we've been tending and actually reforming this building as well. There was a moment in the construction you can see in this shot where, in terms of actually tending to that tree in the walls, there was almost a kind of witnessing the building become what was walls and buildings to corners and then back up again, in terms of giving the space and the remaking of those walls to stabilize them in a new manner, showing the tree extending from beyond that. And this fits, as I just mentioned, a kind of importance for us in terms of relating to the sky and the switch of day to night. We began to really think through what might be as our intention to have a small working, a weatherproof working space on the inside, one that left the original walls alone but sat there. We really started at first to think through how we were going to relate to having a visual representation and consideration between day and night. And so we began to make these very porous skins, but ones that played optically with the eyes in terms of how one sees lines that relate to the eye in terms of brightness and contrast and different levels of darkness. And those actually worked through models in terms of shredded paper, working through metals and kind of caring for those and how that might actually occur, and the real interest in being able to produce that. And then we actually hit a disaster. This was a pre-COVID disaster, and showing the shot maybe is not as impactful as the way my heart sees it. But we actually suffered the accidental loss of 44 trees on our property when the electric company confused our land for city-owned property. And another ordinance within the city is the electric company can cut down anything that's under power lines if it's on city property. If it's on private property, they have to work with the owners. Unfortunately, they thought it was city property. So I arrived to the site one day while it was being wrapped up that I lost 44 trees, which actually took us to a total heartbreak on this project and probably paused for longer than I would like to admit in terms of that kind of loss. So this is another important drawing for us in terms of the what continued on there in terms of just dealing with and sort of resolving how one was going to move forward with the city with the loss of our trees. But I'd say, interestingly enough, what that turned it into then was a newfound inspiration for the inside of the building to be something that could play host to growth instead of the sort of loss that we felt. And so taking what was once the sawdust building and now making it into a secret forest. And so for us, actually in the pandemic, we turned to a process that we use often, which is basically drawing in a space to both understand the project, but also to get to know that space. And that has come up through, and I'll just quickly show a couple of images here for the sake of time. It's quickly come up for us in other projects where we've literally begun to take materials and draw on spaces as a form of sort of ghosting it, or actually allowing those line work to disappear themselves, these being ones on fire, tracing out spaces, just things that ended up being a way for us to not just transform a space, but in essence to kind of ghost it and acknowledge that it's in a transition and that we are keyed in to that sort of transition and interest as well. And so these are a couple images actually that fed the earlier work, and also considerations of these kind of floating ghosts in the space. And if we return now to what we then did inside the hideout, this was a kind of tending and caring that occurred for us as growth during the pandemic, was to string lines in the space where we thought we were going to build the structure. It was, in a way, it was also a kind of test or a full scale. Is this right? Is this long enough? Is this tall enough? But we strung lines and planted hop plants, and allowed them to grow up into the space. And I have a quick 1-minute video. Am I doing okay on time to be able to play this 1-minute video? I'm going to assume that that's a yes. And this just captures the growth, the sadness from the trees, and then it gives you a sense of kind of our care and our patience with the space and what we've been learning so far. My apologies that started playing again. Let me just switch that so it doesn't. And I'll wrap up here. So just to conclude that, my apologies that slipped there. For us, I just wanted to share the kind of relationship to tending to a space, maybe reworking it, taking a pause, and thinking about how the materiality is actually the growth this time, and the growth of the new vegetation, and looking forward to now the building that we've actually completely change in its design and the work that'll go from there. Thanks for letting me share that. I'm gonna hand it over to Virginia now.
Great. Thank you so much, Catie. It's always so wonderful to see the beautiful and delicate structures that you make. And I'm so happy to be in conversation with you and Zain and the students this semester. I have a short video, or not a short video, short presentation to share as well. And I'll just start by sharing my screen. There. So let's see. Okay. So during the time of the pandemic, I have been sheltering in place and quarantining in Southern Colorado in the San Luis Valley. So normally, you know, my practice and my work are in California, in between Oakland and Berkeley and San Jose. And we decided to leave and come to a family ranch here in the San Luis Valley. And since May, we've been here and we've been working on 3 different projects. And I'd like to share these 3 different projects with you today. And I call them a house of mud, a house of snow, and then also a loop ceramics project. This is the house of mud. We call this the Casa covida, which is a house for cohabitation during the time of COVID. And this is a house that has been made this past summer and fall. And it's made out of adobe or mud that's excavated from literally the ground beneath your feet here. And it's been an opportunity for us to think about using local materials, using indigenous and local and traditional building techniques, and combining that with new and emerging technologies such as robotics. And at the same time, we're exploring this technology and using this very traditional material. We also wanted to make a place, to create a place where 2 people could quarantine together, to like be together and to fall in love together and to find or renew or create or make a relationship together. So this is a house for just 2 people to be together. And to give you a little bit of context and background on this region, the San Luis Valley is a high alpine valley. We're located at 8,000 feet above sea level. It's a region where building has been made out of mud for thousands of years. This is the Taos Pueblo, which is about 40 miles south of us. This building is the longest continuously occupied building in the United States. It's made out of adobe and it's mud plastered. So we're building on these traditions which already exist here. And this, of course, was the most ubiquitous building material in the world for thousands of years. And it's only been in the last 100 years that it's been replaced by cement or concrete. This is the robot arm that we're using to create the house of mud, or the Casa covida. It's a Scara printer. It's very small, it's very lightweight. It can be picked up by 1 or 2 people. And the strength, I think, of this is that it's a very small printer that can be used then to print objects or structures that are much larger than itself. So on the right here, you see our fabrication setup. There's the printer, the robot arm in the center of this kind of pizzelli or lattice-like structure that we're printing. It's holding a hose that is then connected back to a continuous flow hopper that we're putting mud in. We're mixing mud in the wheelbarrows with the soil from literally, again, the ground beneath your feet. And we've developed a software called Potterware, which allows, I think, greater accessibility for people to 3D model things that can be 3D printed very quickly. It runs in the cloud. And we're using a more robust version of this software to create these larger structures that we're printing in the desert, including the Casa covida. We're using the soil that exists here. There's kind of tacit knowledge about where the best soil can be collected. It already has kind of the right matrix of clay, sand, and we mix that with chopped straw and water. And we've been experimenting with making smaller structures in the desert. So just to give you a little bit of a background, these are 3 smaller structures that we printed last year. And these were all tests to explore different techniques. So for example, the one in the background that I'm standing on is an exploration in structure. There's a 3D printed stair. So we wanted to know if we could print something that would be strong enough to support the weight of the body. The one here almost in the center is one single line of clay. So we wanted to know how light or how thin we could print the adobe. And we built all of that knowledge in the creation of the Casa Covida. One thing that we learned is that we could only print about 14 to 16 inches high at a time. We had to allow the mud to dry before we could print on top of it. So we created a 4th axis, which allows us to move the robot arm along that axis, and gives us the potential to, instead of printing one single circle or object at a time, it allows us to print multiples. So in this case, we decided to print 3. So we print about 18 inches up, we move the robot, print the next circle, move the robot, print the next one. And that continues on and allows us to print continuously, especially on very sunny, very windy days, which we have, I think, about 330 of over the course of the year here. And so these are the 3 connected spaces that we printed as we moved the robot along that new 4th axis, or that rail that was created. Another kind of innovation that we decided to create or take advantage of was to put the robot up on top of a box. So the robot arm itself is about 7.5 feet tall, but by putting it up on this box, we were able to print up to 12 feet high. So these structures, these enclosures are quite tall. And you can see my partner, Ronald, here driving the robot arm with his smartphone. So the robot is Wi-Fi enabled, and it's very easy to control the speed and the flow rate and the extrusion rate of the mud right there on the site, just using a phone. Here we're about 2/3 of the way up. We decided to use local beetle kill pine to create the lintels, which would allow for the creation of windows and doors. And we just continue printing on top of that lintel, which is just resting on top of the adobe structure below. And here we are at the very top, printing the oculus, which frames the view of the sky. And you can see the structure is composed of 2 layers. There's an inner layer and an outer layer. They're both sine waves. The frequency of the inner layer is twice that of the outer layer, and it supports that outer layer as it curves in to create this oculus, which is the top of the frustrum shape of the room itself. When you enter the Casa Covida, the first experience that you have is to grasp this handle that we've created. This handle is cast out of aluminum, and we developed a process of 3D printing with PLA or bioplastic and putting it again in a mud block. So we're making a mud mold around this 3D printed master, burning out the plastic, and then filling it with aluminum. And like many people during this time, we acquired a pet. We have a cat now, and we found out that Friskies cat food cans are 100% aluminum. So we're recycling that material and using it in our architecture. When you come into the central space, there is a hearth and benches that have been 3D printed for seating, and they have upholstered cushions on top of them. In addition to creating the architecture, we're also creating the objects that you can cook with and serve with in the interior of the space. There's a room for dreaming or sleeping. And we have a small window with a view to the sunset in that room. There's an elevated adobe platform that's covered with churro sheepskins. This is the local sheep from the region. And we have the opportunity to create our own custom textiles for the interior. And we were fortunate enough to work with a local indigenous weaver who's actually a fashion design student in New York. And during the beginning of the shelter in place and the pandemic last year, he had to leave New York and come back home to New Mexico. And he has kind of a wonderful story. His name is Josh Tafoya. You can look him up on Instagram and see all of his work. But he came back home, and so he didn't have access to the sergers and the sewing machines and all of the equipment that he had been using, of course, much like us in architecture. So his aunt gave him a loom and told him that he comes from a family of weavers. And so he started weaving, and he wove these beautiful pillows and blankets for us. And if you look closely, you can see the motif on the pillow is actually the floor plan of the Casa Covida itself. And here on the blanket, the motif is a combination of both the floor plan of the area for sleeping and the oculus or the view looking up. And here's that view, that floor plan looking down. You see the blue water, the water tank, which is actually a tank that the local ranchers around here use for their cattle. There's polished river rocks that make up the flooring. And when you're in the pool, you have the opportunity to look up and see this framed view of the sky. Now, I'm from the deep South. I grew up in places like Savannah, Georgia, Alabama, and I now live in California, which is very temperate. So my world has always been between hot and kind of mild, right? And so here I found myself this past year quarantining in a place that is absolutely freezing. We're 8,000 feet up. We're surrounded by 10 to 14,000 foot mountains. So the cold gets trapped in the San Luis Valley itself. And so when it snows, the snow doesn't melt and the ground doesn't warm up. And sometimes at night, the temperature goes down to minus 34 degrees, which on some days makes this place the coldest place in the contiguous North American states. So it's been a kind of strange and wild new experience for me to be here. But being here made me start to think about the possibility of building with snow, or maybe using or collecting snow to think about how an architecture could be made. And I started to think about how the performance of snow could be taken advantage of in architecture. So it turns out that 93% of snow is just trapped air, and that trapped air never moves. And so it's a great insulator, and it prevents, heat loss. So for example, in this house, which has all the snow piled on it, the warmth from the interior is not transmitted to the exterior. And I also started to think about the aesthetics of snow. And because of my own interest in textiles and my own ancestry and heritage, I was interested in these kind of Scandinavian or Scottish Fair Isle knitting patterns, which made me start to think, could I make a building that collected snow and was kind of had a sweater on it? And so I came up with the idea of creating a tiling system that had a snow catching tile and a snow shedding tile, and putting those two tiles together to create larger 3D printed panels, which would allow me to make any kind of black and white pattern on the surface of a building. And I went through a number of prototypes, but ultimately decided that this was probably the best option. It's the right resolution. And what you're looking at here is about a 3.5 foot wide by 3.5 foot tall 3D printed panel that has the snow motif on it. And the one on the left is 90 degrees. It's perpendicular to the ground. And at this point, it's snowed about maybe 1 or 1.5 inches. And so the white snow that's sitting on the black background is making that snowflake image. And on the other side, what you see is that same prototype that's tilted 45 degrees in the position of a steep roof, which would be common here. And it snowed about 8 or 9 inches. And so what's left is, or what we're seeing now is the black, the underside of the snow catching tile that's making that snowflake motif, which wasn't what I imagined was going to happen, but it's what I am really most delighted with. So I think when I finally get to the point where I'm starting to think about what this architecture might look like or might be formally, I want to capitalize on the angles that I think perform best here. And then this is where I am literally today. So I've printed an 8-foot wall by 8 foot wide by 8 foot high wall, snow catching wall. And there's still maybe 2 or 3 tiles that are missing here, which I have to print tomorrow because we have an 80% chance of snow again this Saturday. So this will be an opportunity to see how a larger version of this concept is working. And here on the right, you can see a close-up photograph of that wall on a very sunny day with these deep shadows. So even when the wall isn't activated by the snow, the pattern is still apparent at certain times of day. And then in addition to this, I've also been exploring the creation of making my own ceramic line. So I have been thinking about this in terms of drinkware, cookware, and hardware. And all of these products are taking advantage of the Potterware software that I showed you earlier in the presentation. So I think I'll just stop share and actually show you these objects because they're here with me and they're small. Drinkware, of course, really simple, right? Espresso cups and saucers. These are easy to make, but the goal here, of course, has been to make something that's really efficient. It's really functional. It can go in the dishwasher. A 6-year-old can use it without breaking it. I'm also making cookware. So this is a bread loaf pan, and it's 3D printed out of micaceous clay here from northern New Mexico. And this clay is an earthenware, and it has mica in it, which is a mineral that helps absorb the thermal shock from fire or heat. And you can cook with this in the oven. You can also put it on an open fire and cook with it. You can put it on the stove top and cook with it. So I've been enjoying cooking in tagines and bean pots and these bread loaf pans that I've made over the course of the year. And when I'm not using them, I put herbs in them from the field. This is wild sage, so that when I cook with it, the food that's cooked in here absorbs, of course, the flavors of the clay, but also the flavors and scents and aromas of the herbs themselves. And then I've also been making what I think of as hardware utensils. So things like candlestick holders. And all of these pieces are designed to be printed with a 4mm nozzle, but every once in a while I misuse the printer. And this one, for example, I accidentally used a 2mm nozzle, but it created this beautiful texture at the top, which I discovered I liked maybe a little bit better than the wider diameter nozzles. And it's led to pieces like this vase, for example, which have this kind of exquisite spaghetti or ramen-like texture of loops and loose threads on the surface of the object itself. And I have this dream for when the pandemic is over of bringing friends and family together for a shared meal that includes not only the food that I make, but having the opportunity to serve it on all of the dishes that I've made and cook it in the objects that I've made as well. And I've found something very gratifying about being able to use these things that I've made during this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Virginia and Catie. This is just so incredible. It's such a pleasure to see, the thoughtfulness and the holistic approach that you both have to creating environments and experiences for other people. So one of the things that I was noticing in both of your works is there's a tendency towards avoiding a most typical idea of architecture with regard to resisting the elements. And somehow this notion of, to use Catie's term, to tend to architecture, you both embrace the elements or the experience that surrounds an architecture to provide, I think, in many ways, otherworldly experiences. So my first question is, what do you have against roofs? Now that's just a joke, but no, my question is, I think that kind of approach to architecture, if I kind of look through the way that you're describing your creative processes, is that you have a really, you both have such an obsessive character with engaging with materials themselves and creating things full scale and live that you're directly connected to. You're not, outsourcing these to someone else to fabricate. At the same time, it's possible to stay like in that internal space and just make things for yourself. There's got to be a moment, because both of the way that you work is not necessarily just well documented, but almost intentionally documented, as if the project and the documentation coincide together to tell a story about the projects. And I'm wondering about like how much presence does documentation have in your creative process? Maybe just to reverse the order, Virginia, do you want to start?
Sure. I think we've learned over the years that it's very important to document and to create a record of your work and to share that. And so my partner Ron is actually very good at posting on social media, and he understands that adrenaline drip, right, of getting new imagery every day. And so he's very good at documenting and putting that work out into the world. And so we're constantly videoing, photographing, and we may not know what the story is at the beginning, but I think by looking at that archive or that collection of documentation and reflecting on it, a story emerges, right? Through revisiting that collection of documents where we have photographed and videographed the work. So it's part of the process, I would say.
I think for me also, I'd say taking photographs was a way to capture things that I thought I either didn't know how to draw or that I myself maybe couldn't do. Documentation in a way works a little bit like a sketchbook for me. And maybe it goes a little bit with your first observation too, Brandon. There's sort of an openness for me in terms of just the consideration of like the light or the elements or the wind or just things that I'm not sure that I would ever know if I did it either away from the site or in a computer. And so I think documentation, to be honest, is something that just completely is always revealing ideas. It's making the project better and better. It's like capturing the things that I wish it could do and always striving that maybe hints to the next project as well.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about your students and Zain's students as well, producing things in their living spaces, which is probably incredibly satisfying or incredibly frustrating, depending on how things are going. And then reaching that moment of thinking, like, am I the only person that's going to see this? And maybe I'll save this question for later, but I'm wondering, like, how important is it that people actually see the physical work versus the documentation? But maybe this might be a great time to transition over and bring Zain into the conversation. We can see a little bit of what's happening in the studio. I just want to also do one call out to everyone joining us in the conversation to please feel free to add questions to the chat. We will get to a conversation real soon. So, Zain, it's really great to have you. Looking forward to seeing this.
Okay, thank you, Brandon, and thank you for the invitation to share the work of the studio. So I'll summarize our efforts very briefly here by sharing my screen to start with. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great.
Looks good.
Okay, so our studio is entitled In-House, and it begins with a kind of very simple prompt to design and build an architectural intervention wherever you are and with whatever is at hand. An intervention that is personally motivated and kind of spatially has a kind of spatial consequence. So a kind of a wall or a ceiling condition, or a piece of furniture or a product or a performance. And as has been mentioned, to support students in their remote making efforts, a desktop-sized milling machine has been developed called the Tiny Z. Here it is milling foam. And so at the basis of this machine kit is a Dremel rotary tool, a couple of water jet components, very easy to mass produce, or at least in small batches, with simple bolt patterns. There's a lot of aluminum extrusions, which are making up most of the framing, cut to length using a chop saw. And the majority of the components are actually off the shelf, making this machine a kind of extremely amenable to rapid reconfiguration and sort of customization. This milling machine can be used manually with turn wheels to develop a kind of intuition for the material being worked and the kind of forces that you can actually reasonably impart with the tool. But it can also be used as a CNC machine, a sort of a hands-free kind of option, which can enable you to realize more precise geometries and potentially with more complexity. Here it is milling aluminum, which I warned students not to attempt because it takes a long time. And being that this machine is rather redundant and modular, it's also kind of flexible enough to be reconfigured and hacked to extend its capabilities. So here, for example, is a long travel 3D scanner. You can attach additional axes to achieve different kinds of multi-axis operations. So this demo demonstrates that with 4-axis pumpkin carving. It can also be made to work with different end effectors. This is a clay extruder that some of the students have picked up in the studio. The point being that there is a kind of a relationship between the configuration of the machine and the kinds of materials that are being worked. And so with all of those sort of provocations, we started our studio with a kind of rules of engagement, by establishing some rules of engagement, termed protocols, which guide our work with the machine, which guide our work with the materials, and which guide our work within our remote context, so sort of an exercise about making space for making. In basements or dorm rooms, and in some cases, the machine is sort of regarded as a tool, in other cases as a collaborator, in yet other cases as a roommate. So here, for example, is the Tiny Z actually prompting the reconfiguration of the room itself. And in other cases, the machine is sort of treated as a kind of scrap material, as raw material from which to draw relevant parts and enter into kind of new syntheses of machine, material, and making, where the goal is, rather than articulate the distinctions between machine and material, to rather blur the lines and blur the boundaries, so to speak. So the materials we've been working with have been bendy and flexible, been sort of wobbly and twisty. Materials that have sagged and drooped over domestic objects and various forms. Materials that drip and smushed together. Materials that are translucent, that modulate light, that can be melted down and recast into new forms, and then remelted again with different tools, yielding different qualities when exposed to light. Materials that have flavor, that possibly taste better when they're fried, but we're waiting on that. Materials that are soft and absorptive, yet have some kind of a structural capacity. Materials that are highly particular, found materials. Materials that grow and respond to light. And so all of our experiments have kind of prompted a sort of, prompted us to look at our remote context in different ways, and kind of engage in a sort of a remapping exercise to look at our spaces with fresh eyes, to develop new workflows and tools to enable our experiments to go further and further. And so that's what's happening now in-house. Architecturally scaled interventions are happening next, and possibly on a campus near you. So thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing now. Okay. So at this point, I think I should introduce two students taking the studio, two graduate students here at MIT, Tristan C. Wright and Daisy Zhang, who will field some questions for us and help moderate.
Yeah, thank you, Zain. Thank you, Virginia and Catie. It was really nice to see some of the work you've showed us already, but also new work. We have a bunch of questions here, but also I think there'll be room for Brandon and Zain to add their own questions in this conversation. And myself and Daisy are gonna go through them. And if you have any questions, please, as Brandon said, type them in the chat and we will try and ask them. So the first one is from Gil, and I think it's mainly for Virginia and Catie. And he has a question about in-house versus outsourced fabrication. And he would like to know, to what extent do you care or not care about making things yourself versus sending out work to be fabricated? And how has this approach evolved over time?
Catie,
I'll go ahead because I care a lot. Honestly, I think probably in the way I've built my practice, I've come through it, just sort of designing through the making. It ends up being, I think, what is the way that I learn and make decisions, and probably most importantly figure out, which I think I've said in our class before, the idea of not seeing something as an error, but seeing it as an opportunity. So I often kind of have difficulty actually handing something over to someone. I have a different relationship to it, feeling that either it's not entirely resolved, I don't know how it interplays exactly with the site. And so I have a tendency, and it has come with the earlier work, to want to make it, even to the extent of wanting to figure it out before I bring in helpers. But I realize now as our work scales more and more, and it's been kind of a slow transition for us, the reality check comes with, there's things we can't physically lift or others can do better. And so I've been trying to learn the balance between experimentation and when it's, sort of a decision also of skill or time or labor that's best put in someone else's hands.
Yeah, I mean, I love making things. Like that's why I'm making all these ceramics, because it makes me so happy, right, to be in that making mode. And I think like Catie, you know, we start everything ourselves, and we usually make it. Sometimes we might hand it off to a student or an employee to make. Like if we make the first 100, then maybe the next 500 are made by someone very close to us. We have been in a situation where maybe we had to 3D print 3,000 of something, and then I started to lose my enthusiasm for making 3,000 of the same thing, or almost the same thing. At which point we did send it out for someone else to make, but it was only at a point where, you know, we were confident that it would be made in the same way that we had made it ourselves in house. And that actually informed the design, because like when we're printing something in house, there's no problem to say print 500 or 1,000 unique parts, but I don't want to email someone 3,000 unique files to 3D print. So the time that we did know that we were going to outsource a project, we actually tried to have as few distinct or different parts as possible. So we actually worked really hard to get the part count down to like 29 unique parts. I think we would have someone print, you know, 50 of these or 100 of these. Interestingly, in this snow project, I printed the first 200 tiles, and then I decided, I'm actually printing them in the bedroom right next to me right now, but I decided I couldn't print them fast enough because it's going to quit snowing here. Like this weekend might be the last snow. So I had to send out some of the files to be printed by a company, 3D Hubs. And for myself, I had figured out the fastest way to print these was to print them 4 at a time standing up. But I couldn't tell 3D Hubs what orientation to print the tiles in. They charge you more. So some of the tiles are printed standing up, some are printed flat, some are printed this way. And then when I put them all on the wall, the sheen is different on every single tile that is printed in a different orientation, even though it's the same material. And so that's something that I know would happen, but of course I don't see it until it's actually installed. And then it's something that I have to decide, do I like that or not? And I mean, in some ways, it's kind of a patchwork of blacks, which could be very beautiful if it were intentional. Or do I want to bring it back in and control it and make sure every single tile is printed in the same orientation and I have that same sheen all the way across the surface? So those are some of the gives and takes and recent experiences around that topic of doing things in-house and out of house.
Well, maybe I can follow up. Oh, Zain, you had a follow up?
Yeah, could I please share an experience from the studio that has been quite inspirational, at least to me. So at some point, our tools have diverged from the sort of the base machine kit. Some people have extruders now, some people have 4-axis machines. But at some point, there was a thought that the extruder design could be improved by something that might require a 4-axis machine that someone else has. And at this point, I thought that it just seemed to me that we had jumped from in-house as a complete modality to a sort of a fluid relationship between outsourcing to a specialized partner. And in that sense, it was kind of extremely inspirational because it meant that the collaboration was still possible in the time of the pandemic, where different specialties, different nodes, if you like, could come together and sort of collaborate and then go off their separate ways, but that the hacks would start to sort of cross-pollinate, which I thought was extremely fun. It hasn't happened yet because in the spirit of making do, we made do and we kept going. It was a little bit faster. But I'd like to think of outsourcing more as a kind of a negotiation or a conversation. With all kinds of pushback. And so the dream maybe is that there will be a series of these little production zones working together and then going off. So
Well, Zain, now that you've made this little preview public, you have to follow through on it. So I'm really looking forward to that. But like maybe I can also pivot on the same topic, because there's an idea of outsourcing fabrication to other fabricators to scale up or to maybe take advantage of other equipment. But I think there's a kind of subtext to this conversation that also has to do with the construction document set and our relationship as the construction document set is the bane of the digital fabricator's existence. And I'm curious because Catie, you showed a close to a construction document, a drawing, and my own personal experience working on construction document sets with you. I'm just wondering, like, how your relationship with construction documents has transformed, or has it been more entrenched?
That's the first one I've done since leaving someone else's office. No, I think, and I mentioned it very quickly earlier. I think Virginia alluded to this too. I think the things that I make them with very close and intimate helpers who it's more so about understanding, like, through the material, this is what has to be done, this is what will work, and this is what won't work. And I think construction documents, more so even just our relationship to drawing, has a lot more to do with things that become very particular, like what might have to be a max dimension or an extent, or what might be an area. I feel like with every project, we're actually making new notational systems. Like, what's an area of density? There's kind of a new form of sketching more than drawing. And so for construction documents, for us, I think I try to keep them at a minimum, but I almost just even have to keep them at a minimum. They don't, the logic of them as standardized for somebody else doesn't work for our own progress in a drawing, if that makes sense, or in a project.
Yeah, and maybe just before, I'm sure Daisy has a question for us, but just to open up for Virginia. I mean, I think the thing that I was connecting there with, like, outsourcing and construction document sets is there came a point where you started to turn this inside out. And so, like, I'm thinking of potterware, where there's no set that you ask someone to reproduce, but like you're working on the drawings of the drawing that come forward. So how, like, was it that you were generating that code yourself and thinking, like, this is a way of building agency for others as well? How did that spark in the practice?
Yeah, I think we started working on potterware, actually a previous version of it years ago with Autodesk. And they had this idea parallel to us that you could just design using the G code, right? Like, you really don't need to model it and slice it and all of that. You just need to take that line of filament or that line of clay for a walk. And so the construction document is now, for me, the visualization of the G code. That's what I look at all the time on the computer, right? But it's just a hairline most of the time. And so, yes, we were using that, I think, to think about how we design differently, right? We're not 3D modeling anymore. And it's become an instrumental way of working. But, in the construction document of this looks nothing like this, right? And there's no way I can know that this is what it's going to look like until I make it. So, yeah, that probably doesn't really answer your question.
I'm seeing some. No, it's incredible, because I'm seeing some resonance with some of the work that Zain's showing of the studio, of dealing with materials that are difficult to predict, like bendy and stretchy, and materials that you cook. So I think this is interesting territory. And Daisy, did you have a question to?
Yeah, we actually have a few questions from the audience related to the pandemic. Carolyn's question is very interesting to add to our discussion of outsourcing. She was wondering that in a studio, everybody is doing their own fabrication at home during the pandemic, which is a decentralized process at domestic scale with non-standard materials. Do you see any potential of this type of small-scale fabrication potentially impact the practice of architecture in the future? And also a very quick question from Joe, that the pandemic has disrupted the global supply chain of material. And do you see your relationship with the material has changed in terms of how you design and how you work with it? Thank you.
Maybe I could also, while the two of you are thinking, because I feel like this is one of those questions that can also go very deep, because one of the things that I feel like the poetics of your presentations touch on, but don't necessarily dive into the deeper social issues that you both address in your work. Like, for instance, Catie, a lot of the material reclamation, and like, what does that have to do with the communities and the context with which you work? That might be a good way of thinking about that. But I'm wondering if maybe we can tackle some of the crises that you both reference in your work as well. Catie, do you want to start? Or Virginia, are you ready? Who's ready?
There's a lot there. Interestingly, I think the time of the pandemic, I think has produced a lot of maybe in a way the kind of sense of making at home and with different materials matches with a kind of agency to be able to do something, but also a sort of, you have to live with what you make in a way. So we've been kind of brought closer to our houses, smaller amounts of people we interact with, staying very close to our community. And I think that has allowed for kind of an increased sort of awareness of, okay, what's here, what's the resource, what's not here, what's the stories, what's the histories, what needs love and care, what needs a change. And so I think all of it, maybe in kind of folding together the two questions too, with even thinking through the kind of outsourced or standardized materials versus what's at the ready. I think in a way the pandemic and carrying forward even with architecture, I would hope has a lot more of being everything from maybe being like less wasteful, more environmentally considerate, but also just like really holding close to the sort of stories of the making and those that are there, and maybe taking care of the spaces we have as opposed to the kind of constant newness of them, and thinking through more a little bit about remaking or reconsidering what making is in the first place, as opposed to just the kind of like, add more of this, do this isn't worth anything anymore. Like I think there's actually more there if we just slow down a little bit and have to understand the things are at our fingertips, not just as kind of resources, but also as like independence and agency and working with those.
Yeah, I think for us, and maybe also for the students in the studio, this has been a moment where you just didn't have access to materials and supplies and tools that you had before. And so you really had to work with the local materials, like literally the dirt that's right there, right? Or the sheepskin that's there, because I couldn't even order skeins of yarn. They were just out of stock. So I had to find someone local who was dyeing it in their backyard, right? And so we found that person through Josh. And of course, those materials and those colors were even more appropriate and beautiful ultimately, right? And so I like that constraint of having to work with what you have there. Another thing that emerged, I think, over the course of the year for us is that we made relationships and connections to other craftspersons in the area. So we've connected with a chef, right, and a photographer and a weaver, and we barter with each other. So, I get photographs and he gets cookware, right? I get food and that person gets a weaving. And so money isn't a part of the equation anymore, but we're all getting exceptional and beautiful and well-crafted pieces that in the world we were living in before, where we were buying, going to Home Depot to get materials, I would never have had those beautiful objects or experiences, right? And so I think that's been a really transformative experience for us, just to be kind of isolated in this community of people who are working with these local materials and craft traditions. And then outside of that, like when I do go back to California and think about being in the Bay Area, it has become one of the most expensive places in the United States, at least prior to COVID. And the rent for a storefront was so insanely inaccessible that someone like me who's making something, in my garage or in my backyard, I could never afford to rent a space. And now all those spaces are empty, right? And the rent is half, it's a fraction of what it was. And I wonder then, is there going to be an emergence of a new type of store, a new type of craftsperson? Are all these new businesses going to emerge because all of those old ones closed down? And I'm kind of excited to see what that's going to be. And it's not going to be these big companies anymore, I don't think, because here we are, we've made all of these things, we're ready to go. What is the future? What does the future look like? Maybe now that I can afford to participate in it, right? So there's a new opportunity, I think, for me and for people like us who are making at home.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the pandemic certainly makes you think differently, or brings to the surface certain things that you start questioning standard practice. And I think neither of you were conventional in any respect, but I'm starting to notice some other trends, not only with regard to like sourcing of materials, but there's an idea of temporality to the work that it kind of resonates with me. I'm starting to think in similar terms, but I'm thinking, Virginia, like the passion that you had in just thinking about the event of a dinner party, or the way that you're sharing, in following Ron's social media, like these things happen, like we experience the construction of the things with you almost. So there's an imagination of what's to come, and then there's the actual staging, the shot of the couple in the space. Like that's an event that's taking place, and there's an idea of time associated with this that I'm imagining you're thinking differently. And Catie, the moonshot is just too good to pass on. So this association, like the reciprocity, not only between like the early era of, I keep saying digital fabrication, excuse me, but like, let's say the early era of fabrication, which was so inextricably tied to form and making complex form. And now we're starting to talk about materials that are difficult to predict in materiality, that are squishy and twisty and stretchy. And the kinds of work that you're doing, which are sometimes, like Catie, as you were describing, even the idea of representing the form is in some ways impossible, that it can only happen at full scale. So you're drawing at full scale. And Virginia, the idea of like modeling the potterware is like, to make it is actually much more satisfying anyway. I'm wondering if any of these things, it's not so much a question, but if this kind of tickles any thoughts that you've had in your heads.
Yeah, I think some of our earlier work was intentionally delicate because in its relationship to time, it wanted to acknowledge that the site was going through a transition and that it itself would probably just get whisked away. And I think as we scale up, and maybe also as we go through different crises, including those of this time, I think we've been trying to figure out like what remains delicate, because I think there's a sort of hope that one isn't doing too much damage, one isn't being too forceful because of all these, because I think all these other things just add that much more to the design and the place, whether it be a condition of light or the story or how the community uses it or what a neighbor, adds to it or something like that. And so, yeah, when you first mentioned time, I think for me, it brought up the idea of wanting to make sure that we carry on even, from these pandemic times now, or these abilities to think even more about what we're making, to make things that are, not just appropriate to this time, but acknowledging that they're at a certain moment in time, and that presumably like we're either making decisions that they're going to last longer than us, or that we're making decisions that we're being resourceful in a way that they are going to get remade or shouldn't last longer than us. So I like to actually expand out on thinking about time and place a little bit more to the spaces and the materials than to us as humans. And I think that's something that maybe this particular moment and being more isolated or insular or making it home has also brought an awareness to just the kind of amount of stuff or things that are around us, and our kind of necessity to be able to say, like, what is the value of this as a physical object, and where is it going to be now and later, and if we're shut down and if we're not shut down, or if we're handing this off to somebody else. So I think maybe time on the scale of material and spaces and our responsibility to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess for me, what's been most amazing is to have the time and the space to get out of the laboratory, right? You know, I'm usually in a studio or a laboratory with 30 3D printers. And so to think about going out into the landscape and think about, how do I 3D print with geology, and how do I 3D print with atmosphere? To get out into the landscape. And, you know, I want to, like, now I have this idea, I want to print with smoke. Like, are we going to have fires again in the fall? And I need to be ready to think about how additive manufacturing and the smoke that's going to be in the atmosphere, the ash, I think I can print with the ash, right? So I'm now invested in this idea of the world as my laboratory. And so I think that's where maybe I am in terms of time and space, right?
Virginia, there's one thing I'm just thinking of based on what, thank you very much for that answer. There was something that Catie was saying towards the end that made me think of the furry curry pot. I hope I'm getting the title right. I can never forget this thing. And I know you didn't present this today, but somehow the furry curry pot encapsulates all these things, because it seems to me that you weren't thinking of the human experiencing the object more so as you were personifying the object, or thinking from the point of view of the object. And for the audience, Virginia made this pot, which was 3D printed out of curry, that was called the furry curry pot. And I'm not doing it complete justice here, but somewhere in here is like wrapping in a sensorial experience with people, the idea that this thing has its own being of itself, that deals with materiality in alternative ways. Virginia, could you just share a little bit, because this is a little bit earlier work, and we asked you two to share, like, what are you working on now? What's happening in the pandemic? So maybe understanding a little bit of your approach to even just naming those objects would be really great. And then maybe we have time for one more question following that.
Well, I think with the furry curry casserole dish, you know, I was interested in this notion of things, of exploring the other senses, right? So it's not just about the way something looks, but it has this bumpy furry texture. I also want to make a furry building one day, right? And so it has this beautiful haptic quality, and it kind of looks like it would be soft, but it's not. It's rigid. And of course, the aroma of the curry and the turmeric pervade whatever space they're in. So when you put this object in a room, it literally seasons the whole room. So I was interested in this idea of making something that would season or flavor an interior space. And I was also interested in the idea, and I'll come back to cooking a lot because that's a very fast, gratifying way to make things, right? So there's happiness there for me again, but that you could put rice or you could put noodles in the furry curry casserole dish, and the object itself would start to season or flavor the food that you're eating or consuming. So it's really, I think, the driver of the space and the way we interact with the space, both physically and through smell, and taste, etc. So that was, I think, those were some of the ideas in that piece and in that early work.
Great. Maybe Tristan, do you have another question? Oh, great.
Yeah. So we have another sort of future-orientated question, and the question actually, it references our studio in-house and how we've been given the tools and materials to work from home, but obviously we're still lacking any kind of spontaneous in-person instruction. So, you know, we're getting instruction from Zain online, but we don't have that kind of side-by-side thing that you get in the studio. And the question's wondering how you have valued in-person work with larger groups of people in studio making things, and how that has changed over the last year or so, and how you look at it going forwards. I would say there's emphasis on the ability for that to help drive a project, but also the experience of just the enjoyment of working around other people.
I mean, I'll just add in terms of the magic of what collaboration can do. You know, and the heart of a real collaboration allows for things that could not have been done individually, or something that one would never think of. I mean, honestly, I'm a rather introverted creative. There's a lot of just kind of working through things and really listening to material. So oftentimes the material feels like the collaborator when I have to work on my own. But I think in the pandemic, with not having the just kind of someone walking by or saying something or not seeing things, it's actually been of great interest, I think, in terms of the different ways that others have been connecting, to connect more outside of our discipline, to in a way kind of hear how people are dealing with things that are going on in their own discipline across the pandemic, but how that actually has been the source of conversation, of feeling somewhat grounded in this maybe reshaping of how should we be in the world now, or what should we be thinking about. So I think I've actually been fed maybe more from, meaning just in terms of how the interactions are happening, being fed more from those in other disciplines as I learn, like, what has it meant for their life now, away from a theater, or away from being able to cook, or away from larger conversations and things like that. So I hope that more of that is to stay, right, in terms of just like where we're receiving our inputs, and the kind of push on the work, but definitely also think the kind of joy of being in a lab with those who understand how to make, or how the machines work, is something, is a sort of influence that does need to come back, in terms of the chance opportunities that occur just when somebody passes by and says, why are you doing it that way? Or I saw this other thing when I did this, or this, look what happened, and it stirs a whole another project. So I think it's kind of the balance of being near to those in maybe the exploration process, but being near to those outside of our discipline when it comes to us expanding how we actually relate to the rest of the world right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely missing not being able to touch all of the things that you guys are making in studio. There's so many times when I really want to pick up that piece of milled wax, right? And I really want to eat what you've been extruding, Tristan. And so I'm really missing that. But, those haptic, other sensorial qualities, right, that are so important to me and are in my work. And I'm missing that relationship with you and with my own students at San Jose. So I want that back very much. But on the other hand, like Catie said, there are these other inputs that we had probably had access to before, but they weren't so pervasive. I recently went to the NCECA conference online, which is the big ceramics conference. And there was one whole talk just about Instagram and ceramics, which is amazing that someone could talk about Instagram and ceramics for 1 hour, right? And she showed all these amazing instances where potters are showing their craft online, and how the craft is actually changing because now they're working to share their work through Instagram. And, so like dance was becoming a part of the way someone makes a piece of pottery, right? Or they were, working on the wheel, and you could see them spinning the wheel, and it was accelerated, and there was music. And so now sound is a part of it as well. And I like that, I like that kind of new input that's coming, right? That someone who's been working alone in a lab or in a ceramic studio all these years, now the only way to get their work out there is by making a really fetching video that catches our attention and it's wrapped. And so I like sharing that way and learning that way. And I hope that continues as well, right?
But yeah, and in a moment when we're really taking advantage of the ability to do a transcontinental collaboration on a fabrication studio, we're also very much looking forward to colliding paths in person very soon. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone for this collaborative conversation that we've had tonight, and also in particular for Catie and Virginia for your really thoughtful time with us tonight. Thank you so much. And now I will transition over to the official closing remarks for tonight. Thanks everyone for coming this evening. We hope you'll be able to join us next week for 2 very special lectures. On Thursday, April 22nd at 6 p.m. There's a lecture hosted by the MIT program in Art, Culture, and Technology titled Future Heritage by MIT professor Azra Aksamija. And that will be with Ulrich Al-Khamis, the director of the Aga Khan Museum. And on Friday, April 23rd at noon, 12 p.m., the 30th Arthur H. Shine Memorial Lecture, The Hospital, The Allure of Complexity, by Christine Benwenker, in conversation with Jason Franson, Hashim Sarkis, and students from the department. You can also see the full list of upcoming events at the website architecture.mit.edu, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.
All right, everyone, thank you. The webcast